Well, good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim. Today we continue reading The Bishop Who Ate His Boots with Chapter 11, Part A. Scarcely a month went by when the bishop was not on the move in the course of his episcopal labors. In summer he traveled up and down the Yukon River on steamboats which plied regularly between Dawson and Whitehorse, or by gasoline launch. Traveling by steamer meant his visits often had to be quite short, but whenever the boat stopped, he would go ashore and greet the woodcutter or others who might be at hand. From time to time the vessel stopped to take on wood or to deliver mail and supplies. Her nose would be turned against the current and nudged into the bank, with the stern wheel pounding gently to keep the boat from drifting downstream. A narrow gangplank would be pushed ashore to enable a purser to land. If the bishop was on board, he would be the first off the ship and the last aboard, as he chatted unhurriedly with lonely settlers, inquired about their well-being, passed on any news of relatives or friends along the river, and gave them whatever magazines he had available. Contemporaries remember how the ship's captain would call, quote, "Come on, Bishop, come on! We must leave! Get aboard, Bishop!" unquote. He always seemed to be on the point of being left behind, but never was. The village of Carmacks was one of the regular ports of call for the riverboats, and a comment from his son-in-law shows the bishop's happy faculty for taking advantage of every opportunity to see his people. Near Carmacks the river had innumerable bends, which increased the mileage and time in travel. "At one point," wrote Bishop Herbert Wilkinson, "we left the steamer to walk 3 miles by road to Carmacks. The steamer had to follow a longer route, and by walking smartly we could reach Carmacks a full hour before." The bishop doffed his coat and collar and trudged along the hot dusty trail. When we had reached Carmacks, he visited every cabin and home in the hour at his disposal. It was wonderful to see how many people welcomed him, and how his presence aroused their affection and regard. He had a word for everyone. When departure time came, he went on board hot and tired, but having once again shown his care for the people as their Father in God. It was characteristic of him to think nothing of his own comfort or convenience, but to give every bit of time he could to being in touch with his people. Not all his visits were so short, and sometimes the bishop would spend several days in a mission visiting the people and conferring with the missionary. Miss Kathleen Martin, the missionary teacher at Fort Selkirk, described one such visit. Quote, "The bishop arrived on Friday. I was making cakes, and he came in and chatted while I rolled them out. Then, of course, I forgot the fire, and they were as hard as rocks. However, the bishop cheerfully crunched them up when I put them on the table. We had 4 services on Easter Day, a communion service at 10 a.m., an Indian service at 11 a.m., another Indian service at 4:30 p.m., and a white service at 7:30 p.m. I played for all 4 services and was pretty weary when night came. Monday I had a short session of school, and at 4 p.m. 5 babies were baptized. There was a christening feast afterwards, ending with a dance to which we were all invited, and we did go to the dance. Yesterday an old couple were married. I played for both those ceremonies, by the way. The native worker told the bishop to ask that schoolgirl if she would play. Tomorrow we have a confirmation service, and on Friday another wedding. I think the bishop may have to spend another Sunday here. We're all hoping he will," unquote. And in the following letter, quote, "The bishop left on Tuesday night about midnight. I missed him greatly for a couple of days. He is such good company. He seemed well satisfied with the way I was conducting my work, and thought I was making much progress with the children," unquote. Another of Bishop Wilkinson's reminiscences had to do with the time that he was a student missionary at Teslin in the southern Yukon. Bishop Stringer intended to visit Teslin and was to travel in a small open boat with a guide. Quote, "This guide was rather a rough character who was not accustomed to traveling with a bishop, and was a little apprehensive about transporting an Episcopal passenger. I told him beforehand that he would have no worries. When the journey was over I met him and asked him how he was getting along with the bishop. 'Oh,' he said, 'he's a wonderful man. You know, we were nearly in a bad predicament. The current caught our boat and forced it among some rocks, which bent the propeller blade. We had to beach the boat and try to get the stern out of the water to mend the propeller. The bishop is a most powerful man. He stood in the deep water with his shoulder against the boat and heaved it up so that I could work on it. If it hadn't been for his help, I would be sitting there yet." This was certainly an interesting introduction to an episcopal visitation. Many of the bishop's journeys were equally arduous, yet some were not without a touch of humor, at least in retrospect. On one of his long and lonely journeys, he was unfortunate enough to lose his horse. While the bishop took a needed rest, the animal strayed away, and all efforts to find him were fruitless. The bishop had no alternative but to continue on foot, and as he did so, he met another traveler coming in the opposite direction, in exactly the same predicament, except that he had lost 2 horses. They agreed on a meeting place should they find the missing animals, and separated. After a time, the bishop came upon the 2 horses, and turned back to restore them to their owner. One of the horses was laden with winter supplies, which the traveler had been to town to buy. To return the horses proved to be no mean task. The bishop made his way along the trail, but soon a torrential rain began, and he was quickly drenched. Then part of the trail led through thickly wooded country, and the pack-horse, by rubbing his burden against the trees, was constantly shedding parcels in all directions, involving the weary and often repeated process of repacking. The end of the wood was reached, but there was further trouble ahead. A small brook across the trail had been swollen by the rain until it had become a rushing torrent. The only way of crossing it was by means of a fallen log, which lay rocking and swaying across angry waters. Undaunted, Bishop Stringer began the crawl across the log, taking the pack-horse to swim beside him, and presumably leaving the other horse to follow. Great was his horror when midway in the stream the water rose above the horse's head and it disappeared, with its burden beneath the surface. Only too well did the bishop know the value of the horse and supplies, and the hardship and difficulty which their loss would mean to the owner. Making the best of the situation, he scrambled along the log, clinging grimly to the bridle. The horse reappeared, and both man and beast reached the far side. The bank, however, was high, and the horse slithered back into the water in an attempt to climb it. After several attempts, the bank was scaled, and the journey resumed. On reaching the meeting place, Bishop Stringer restored the animals and supplies to their owner, who roared with laughter when he heard what had happened. A further incident revealed both the hardships imposed on northern travelers and the resourcefulness of Mrs. Stringer in meeting difficulties. In August 1912, the bishop was returning from Fort Yukon on the steamer St. Michael, when he felt an acute pain in his right side, which he diagnosed as appendicitis. When they reached Eagle, Alaska, at 10 o'clock that night, Whitaker, who was accompanying him, telegraphed to Mrs. Stringer in Dawson. Meanwhile, the pain grew worse, and the bishop spent the night in agony, while Whitaker applied such medications as he could. The ship continued, and when they reached 40 Mile at 9 o'clock the next morning, there was a wire from Mrs. Stringer giving instructions for emergency treatment. However, this was not enough for Mrs. Stringer, and after dispatching her reply, she became increasingly anxious. The next day she tried to secure a motorboat, but was unable to do so, and borrowed a canoe. She found the doctor, persuaded John Hawksley, the Indian agent, to come along to manage the canoe, and at 6 o'clock in the evening the 3 of them set down the fast swirling waters of the Yukon. They landed about 13 miles above 40 Mile, and soon after midnight the steamer appeared. Hawksley lit a storm lamp and waved it high. For a minute or two they waited, anxious, in case the vessel should miss their signal, but the engines slackened, and she nosed her way into the bank. Mrs. Stringer, the doctor, and John Hawksley went aboard, and the canoe was hauled on deck. The doctor hastened to the bishop's cabin to do what he could. In a few minutes the ship's engines resumed their normal throb, and she was plowing her way upstream to Dawson, to hospital, and to safety. Early in 1920, Bishop Stringer went to Ottawa, having been summoned to give evidence before the Reindeer Commission, which met on February 5th. He was before the commission for an hour and a half, urging the importation of reindeer for the benefit of the Eskimos. A day or so later, at the invitation of the Duke of Devonshire, the Governor-General, the bishop called on him. The Duke showed great interest in the Yukon and asked many questions. The bishop was invited to return for lunch the following week. The Duke and Duchess plied him with questions and expressed the hope that they would be able to visit the Yukon. The bishop's health during this period was precarious, and in the diaries for 1919 and 1920 there are a number of references to medical examinations. At the end of September 1919, he underwent a thorough physical examination at the Clifton Springs Sanatorium in New York. It was apparently forbidden by the doctors to spend the winters in the north for the present. There was some suggestion that he should visit the Kangra mission in India on behalf of the MSCC, but the plan never materialized. The Duke and Duchess of Devonshire were unable to visit the Yukon, but the visit was made by their successors, Viscount and Lady Byng, in the summer of 1922. Mrs. Stringer was away from home when the vice-regal party visited Dawson, but the bishop lunched with them and afterwards took Lady Byng to his home to show her some of his curios. On the following day he traveled with them to Whitehorse by steamer. Quote, "Decided to go on to Carcross as the train was going and the Governor-General's private car was attached to the train. At Carcross the school was all lined up and their excellencies inspected them and talked to the children and staff. Met wife and Wilfred and Randall here. They arrived from Toronto a week ago. Presented Carcross people to the Governor-General and Lady Byng and Lady Boscawen. Their party left on the steamer Tutshi for West Taku and Atlin." Unquote. Typical yet fascinating was the journey which the bishop and Mrs. Stringer took to Mayo in the summer of 1921. It was like hundreds of other journeys, yet once again shows the bishop's great concern for his people and his careful attention to detail. Most of July 19 was occupied with last-minute correspondence and with packing up for the trip, which would last a little more than 2 weeks. In the afternoon, the luggage was taken down to the dock to be placed on board the steamer Nasatlin. Lining the water's edge were the usual group of well-wishers who greeted the arrival and departure of every steamer. With the Stringers on this voyage was Reverend Julius Kendi and his family and their dogs. The riverboats nearly always carried extraordinarily varied cargo. Julius Kendi was on his way from Peel River to his new appointment at St. Mark's, Mayo. As the mooring lines were cast off, the bishop turned his attention to the people on board. Doubtless, before he turned in for the night, he had chatted briefly with each of the officers, members of the crew, and passengers on the ship. The steamer chugged steadily up the Yukon, pausing now and again at wood camps or at the cabins of isolated settlers. The river was a busy highway, although its supremacy was being challenged by roads and motor cars. In the evening they came to the mouth of the Stewart River. As the steamer paused to unload freight and mail, the Stringers made their usual round of calls with a friendly and sympathetic greeting for each of the inhabitants. On the way once more, the Nassauin turned up the Stewart River and continued her journey past Scroggle, McQuesson, and other small settlements to Mayo, at the end of this particular journey. The bishop and Mrs. Stringer spent the next few days visiting in the vicinity of Mayo, chatting with both Indians and whites, and pausing to speak with those who were working on the roads. Motor cars were making their appearance, and it was necessary to link the various towns and settlements by a system of highways. From Mayo they went to Keno City, a new mining town, where they talked to the miners, ministered to them as far as circumstances allowed, held services for them in the mess hall of the mining camp, and distributed magazines and reading material. On Sunday, July 31st, they were in Mayo again, and in the morning the bishop went with Julius Kendi to the Indian fish camp at the mouth of the river. Quote, "Julius and I took service, and I spoke to the people about Julius coming to them and their duty to him in the church. 38 present. Julius gave an address also." Unquote. In the evening he took a service for the white population, and the congregation of 33 people filled the school. One of the residents accompanied the hymns on his violin, and the bishop preached a sermon on the story of Zacchaeus. On the following day, there were conferences about the site for the church and rectory. Several pieces of property were examined, and the preference seemed to be for some lots on the hill overlooking the water. In the late afternoon, Bishop and Mrs. Stringer drove to Minto Bridge and Hyatt Creek, stopping to talk to each person they saw, and holding a service at 9 o'clock in the mining camp mess room. There were 17 present, and the bishop gave them a very practical, down-to-earth talk on the parable of the pounds. They returned by car and reached Mayo at midnight. The bishop noted in his diary that they had accomplished the journey of 22 rough miles in 2.5 hours. Truly, the face of the Yukon was changing. Early the next day, the bishop completed the purchase of the church property. 4 of the lots at the site agreed upon were bought for $850. Following this, he and Mrs. Stringer made several calls, then boarded the steamer Thistle, which was to take them back to Dawson. At other times, Bishop Stringer traveled down the river to Fort Yukon, Alaska, and up the Porcupine River to visit Old Crow Rampart House and other settlements in the northeastern corner of the diocese. He made such a trip in 1924, accompanied by Mrs. Stringer, and then they went on to visit Fort McPherson and the missions along the Arctic coast. They left Dawson on the launch Hazel B. They had said their farewells to their daughter, Rowena, at home since she was teaching at the public school and must return to her classroom. She was also to supervise the mail during her father's absence, dealing with routine matters and forwarding the letters which required his attention. Wilfred and Randall were at the dock to see them off in the company with a number of friends and well-wishers. The launch was small and inadequate, but conveyed them to their destination. They called at each of the missions on the way downstream, then tied up for the night at Eagle, Alaska, where they stayed at a hotel. On their arrival at Fort Yukon, they were met by Dr. Grafton Burke, the resident medical missionary, who took them up to the Episcopal Church mission house. There had been many visits such as this, for in order to visit some parts of his diocese, the bishop had to pass through Fort Yukon. Mrs. Burke had referred to one such visit in the biography of her husband. Her elder son had just been born, and, quote, "Bishop Stringer endeared himself to us for all time. Not only did he take over the kitchen work so that the doctor could attend to his practice as well as his new son, but he regaled us with stories of his early adventures, which kept us constantly entertained. When I was permitted to come downstairs, he also taught me to make new yeast from dried potatoes, sugar, and flour, without using leftover leaven. However, the yeast jug, placed on a shelf over the kitchen stove to ferment, exploded loudly in the middle of the night, and thus revealed the bishop's extraordinary taste in pajamas and nightcap. Bright red with polka dots, if you please. The spectacle of the dignified bishop bursting out of his room in that amazing costume was one which my husband and I laughed over with the bishop many times afterwards. He explained, when his secret was out, that he was so tired of wearing clerical black that in the privacy of his bedroom he indulged his love for brilliant colors." Unquote. On another occasion in 1917, when the bishop had made the journey alone, he had traveled up the Porcupine in the mission launch, Pelican. Archdeacon Hudson Stuck was left to account for that journey, although without mentioning the bishop's name in his book Voyages on the Yukon River and its Tributaries. The Pelican, 32 feet long, with a beam of 8 feet, quote, "was brave in new paint without and within of her spring overhaul, her white sides gleaming in the perpetual sunshine as she plowed the sparkling water, her tanks full of gasoline, her lockers full of grub, her cushions recovered, her curtains washed, her mosquito bars carefully repaired, some new books on her little library shelf, and some new aluminum utensils in her lower galley. When she took the bishop aboard and ran his purple pennant up the flagstaff that surrounds her cabin, she felt herself not unfit equipage for Arctic waters." Unquote. And we'll stop there for this week. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 11, Part 2. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.